My name is Walter Grant. I am 81 years old, though I feel older in the mornings and a little younger in the quiet hours after dusk. I live, or perhaps more accurately, lived, in the house my parents bought in 1954, a modest three-bedroom craftsman tucked into a now unfashionable neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles. I was born 2 streets over, in a house that no longer exists. My wife, Miriam, passed away 9 years ago from a slow, mean cancer that took her in pieces. Since then, the days have been slow, and the nights slower, but the house remained, solid, familiar, and full of echoes. It was where we raised our son, Edgar, and where I had planned to live out my remaining years in peace. For a long time that peace held. I had my routines. I woke early, always before the sun, and made myself oatmeal the way Miriam used to, thick with cream, a pinch of salt, and just enough sugar to remember her by. I would read the paper, cover to cover, even the classifieds, even though I wasn't looking for anything. I kept the garden tidy, fed the birds, walked 3 blocks to the pharmacy and back most days just for the movement, the familiarity, the nods from neighbors who'd known me 40 years or more. I watched game shows in the afternoon, and sometimes old westerns. My world was small, but it was mine. Then Edgar came to me with an idea. He and his wife, Belinda, were struggling financially. He said the rent in Pasadena was unsustainable, and Belinda was between careers. He used that phrase exactly, as if marriage to a woman like Belinda was a series of brief but dramatic performances, each more entitled than the last. Edgar asked if they could move in for a short while, just until they saved up enough for a down payment on a house of their own. I hesitated. The house was quiet, sacred in its silence. I knew what would be lost. But Edgar was my son, my only child, and I had not always been a good father. I had missed piano recitals, come home late from work too many nights, and I had yelled more than I should have, especially during those stormy high school years when he came home smelling like beer and lies. Letting them move in felt, in some twisted way, like a chance to be useful again, to show him that I could still be generous, still be needed. They moved in on a Saturday. Edgar had rented a U-Haul and borrowed a dolly from his friend. Belinda arrived in yoga pants and large sunglasses, complaining that the house smelled like old paper and eggs. She called my beige walls depressing, and said the kitchen looked like a crime scene from the 80s. Edgar didn't defend the place, or me. He just smiled awkwardly and suggested they start by repainting the guest room. By the following weekend, they'd turned the den into a makeshift office for Belinda's consulting business, though I never once saw her meet a client. The living room was rearranged, my books boxed up and replaced with glass vases and oddly aggressive throw pillows. The dining room became Edgar's workspace, scattered with blueprints and job estimates for projects I suspected he was only pretending to be busy with. I was gently, but unmistakably, pushed out of every shared space in my own home. Still, I didn't complain. Not at first. I tried to be invisible. I took my meals in the kitchen before they came downstairs, cleaned up after myself, made fewer trips to the living room, but even silence became a kind of crime. Belinda began sighing whenever I entered a room, exaggerated and sharp, like a child pretending to be annoyed. She started leaving notes on the fridge. Please remember to rinse dishes. Try to keep the hallway clear. No cooking past 9 p.m. Smells linger. I obeyed these instructions the way a stray dog learns to avoid a boot. Edgar, when he spoke to me, did so with the weariness of a man being asked for too much by someone who offers too little. Try to work with us, Dad, he said one evening, after I'd knocked on their bedroom door to ask if I could borrow the vacuum they'd relocated upstairs. We're doing the best we can. But they weren't. Not really. They were doing the best for themselves. They used my house as a free hotel and treated me like the aging doorman. I began to feel like a tenant in the space I'd once ruled with quiet dignity. Belinda's small humiliations turned into larger trespasses. She told Edgar that I left the stove on, though I hadn't. She claimed I'd confused her name with my late wife's, though I never had. She corrected me at dinner over facts I knew to be true. Things like the year Kennedy was shot, or the name of our old dog. I could feel her tightening the noose of incompetence around me, slowly, methodically. Still, I endured. I told myself I could outlast them, that eventually they'd move out, that Edgar would remember who I was to him. But months passed, and their departure was never mentioned again. I learned to fold into the corners of my house, to anticipate their movements and avoid them. I took my evening walks longer, my breakfasts quicker. I became something between a burden and a background noise. Then came the day, though I didn't yet know it was coming, when Belinda told me, flatly, that they were having guests from out of town and I'd need to find somewhere else to stay for a few nights. She said it in passing, as if it were a natural request, like asking someone to pick up the mail. Edgar stood behind her, his face blank, pretending to be distracted by something on his phone. I stared at them both, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. Belinda crossed her arms and added, "I think it's best for everyone's comfort." I wanted to say, "This is my house. My name is still on the deed. My father died in that room upstairs, and my son took his first steps in this kitchen." But I said nothing. I simply nodded, walked to my bedroom, and began to pack a bag. As I stood in front of my closet, folding shirts with fingers that trembled not from age, but from something colder, betrayal, I realized how complete their erasure of me had become. I was no longer inconvenient. I was dispensable. I left the house that afternoon with a worn canvas duffel, an envelope of cash I kept in the desk drawer, and the slow, spreading certainty that something irreversible had taken root in the walls of that house. Something I had let happen, slowly, like rot beneath the floorboards. I stepped onto the street and heard the door close behind me. It made no sound of regret. I didn't know then where I would sleep that night. I only knew one thing with clarity. I would not come back the same man. Something had broken, but something else had begun to stir. I left the house under a sky that didn't care. The light was brittle, colorless, the kind of Californian afternoon that promises warmth but gives only glare. I walked slowly, partly because of the stiffness in my knees, partly because I didn't know where I was going. The last time I'd carried a bag like this was in 1972, on a business trip to Denver. Back then, I had a wife waiting for me at home, a boy who cried when I left and hugged me tight when I came back. Now, I had no home, no waiting, no cry. Just a duffel bag, a bitter taste behind my teeth, and a heaviness in my chest that no aspirin could touch. I took the bus because it was familiar. At the terminal, I sat for a long while on a hard bench that smelled of disinfectant and sweat, watching people go places. Families with too many bags, college students with earbuds and lazy posture, tired men in work boots. I could have gone to a motel, but the ones I remembered had turned into something else over the years. Syringe hotels, police blotter names. I flipped through my old flip phone, the one Edgar had once laughed at. "Dad, this belongs in a museum." That phone now held every number I had in the world. I dialed 3 of them. No one answered. Old friends, either dead, moved away, or politely unbothered. One number had been disconnected. Another rang to voicemail that still said, "Hi, this is Hank and Claire," in voices that sounded 30 years younger than they could possibly be now. By nightfall, I ended up at a downtown shelter, not because I had to, not yet, but because I didn't want to spend $200 on a motel where no one would know my name. The woman at the desk was kind, didn't flinch when I said I'd been kicked out by family. "You're not the first," she said, handing me a clipboard. "You won't be the last." She called me sir, which I hadn't heard in a while, and offered me a clean bed and a tray of what passed for food. I lay on the cot that night, surrounded by coughs and low muttering and the smell of wet socks and Lysol. I stared at the ceiling and tried to believe this was temporary, that Edgar would call, that Belinda would realize what she'd done, that someone would care. They didn't. The phone stayed silent. The next morning, after dry toast and lukewarm coffee, I sat in the small rec room by the window. A volunteer named Richard, probably no older than my grandson, was talking to another man about veterans' benefits. I wasn't listening until I heard the word ownership. That snapped me awake. I waited until the conversation ended, then approached the desk. "Sorry," I said. I couldn't help overhearing. "You said something about deeds?" He looked up, attentive. "Are you a homeowner, sir?" I hesitated. Well, yes, I was. American. The house is in my name. Or at least, I think it is. I explained briefly that my son and his wife had moved in, how they'd slowly taken over, how I was now, gesturing around the shelter, here. He didn't laugh, didn't pity. He asked questions, gently, professionally. Did I remember signing anything? Did I have any paperwork? Did I receive mail at the address? I told him I hadn't signed anything. Not recently. Years ago. Maybe something about the utilities, but nothing else. He nodded. Then legally, it's still yours. If your name is on the deed and you haven't transferred ownership, you're still the owner. And if they kicked you out without a court order, that's not just cruel. It's illegal. That word landed hard. Illegal. Up until that moment, I'd been thinking in the soft language of family, hurt feelings, misunderstandings, cold shoulders. But now, here was someone calling it what it was, not just a betrayal, a violation, something that had consequences. Richard gave me a card, an attorney who worked pro bono with seniors. "Talk to her," he said. "She sees a lot of cases like this." I made the call that afternoon from the payphone in the hallway. The attorney's name was Naomi Kessler. She answered on the second ring, with a voice that was brisk but not unkind. I told her my story in one long, uninterrupted breath. She asked me to come in the next day and bring any documentation I had. I still had my wallet, which contained my ID, and I knew the deed was somewhere in the file cabinet at home. At their home now. But I remembered enough. The house had never been refinanced. The taxes were in my name. The bills, too, though Belinda had started switching them to online accounts. I knew my status. I just hadn't believed it would matter. The next day, I took the bus to Naomi's office. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, dressed in a navy suit with a stain on one cuff she hadn't noticed. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're not the first father I've met who's been pushed out by his own children. But the law's on your side. If the deed is still in your name, or even partially in your name, they have no right to remove you without due process." She tapped her pen on a legal pad. "Do you want to go back?" The question stunned me, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I didn't know. Did I want to return to a place where I had been made to feel like a ghost? Was it home anymore? Or was it just a house now, occupied by strangers who wore my son's face? "I don't know," I said quietly. "But I don't want them to have it." She nodded. "That's a good enough start." Naomi filed a property check. Within 2 days, she confirmed what I'd suspected. The deed was still entirely in my name. Edgar and Belinda were not listed as co-owners. Whatever claims they thought they had, they didn't have them legally. And that changed everything. I moved out of the shelter and into a small, clean motel by the freeway, with a weekly rate and a fridge that hummed like an old man's breathing. Naomi connected me with a realtor, a tough, no-nonsense woman named Clarissa, who wore boots and drove a dented sedan with half a bumper sticker that said, "I break for..." something she'd peeled off in shame. Clarissa took one look at the address and said, "You could sell this in 2 weeks, all cash. This neighborhood's on fire. People want old homes they can flip. You ready to list?" I wasn't. Not yet, but I asked her what the house was worth. She smiled. "Right now, somewhere around 1.1, 1.2 million. More if it's in decent shape." I laughed. Once the sound cracked and foreign in my throat. They called it dated. Said it smelled like mildew. Clarissa grinned. Buyers call that character. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the motel chair looking at the peeling wallpaper, at the stack of legal documents Naomi had provided. I had choices. I had leverage. For the first time in months, I had the upper hand. They had put me on the street. They had assumed I wouldn't fight, that I'd disappear, or die, or become a burden to the city. But I had not disappeared. I had not died. I had found my footing in the place they thought I'd crawl from in shame. And now they were going to learn something they hadn't yet understood. I was still here. And I had returned not with a suitcase, but with a buyer, and a lawyer, and a name that still meant something. Walter Grant, homeowner. The notice of sale went out on a Monday morning. Naomi had drafted it carefully, with the kind of language that wore a tie even on weekends. Formal, restrained, but firm. It informed the occupants of 1187 Halberd Street that the property was being prepared for market, that viewings would begin within 10 days, and that they had no legal claim to the home unless they could provide documentation proving otherwise. A copy was sent by certified mail, another posted directly to the front door in a plastic sleeve, weatherproof and impossible to miss. I didn't hear from them that day. Not the next day either. The silence had weight. I imagined Belinda's face turning red with outrage, imagined Edgar pacing, saying something weak and pointless like, "There must be a misunderstanding." I imagined their world tilting, just slightly, the first flicker of consequence touching their perfect little illusion of dominance. I took no joy in this. Well, maybe a little. But it was more like a deep, cold satisfaction, the kind that seeps into your bones and says, "You are not invisible." On Thursday afternoon, the phone rang in my motel room. The number was local, but unlisted. I answered it without thinking. A pause, and then Edgar's voice, strained and falsely casual. "Dad." That single syllable was like a pin dropped into water. "We got your letter." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch. He cleared his throat. "Look, this is crazy. You don't have to do this. We were just... things got tense, yeah, but selling the house? Come on." I let a moment pass, then replied in a tone stripped of warmth. "You asked me to leave, Edgar. On your wife's orders. You didn't call. You didn't check if I had a place to sleep. You changed the locks, didn't you?" He didn't answer that. "I lived in a shelter for 3 nights. Did you know that?" Still nothing. Then a motel. Been eating soup from a can, sitting on a plastic chair. You never once tried to find out if I was safe. "Dad, we thought you needed space. You were always complaining, always judging us. Belinda said..." I cut him off. "Belinda speaks for you now." His voice dropped. "She's my wife. And I'm your father," I said more quietly than I intended. "But you chose her comfort over my existence. You let her talk to me like I was an employee. Number not even that, like a squatter in my own home." The line was quiet for a long time. Then, in a low, embarrassed tone, Edgar muttered, "She gets upset. You know how she is." "I know how she is," I said, "and I know how you are. That's why I'm selling the house." He raised his voice then, the first time I'd heard real anger in him in years. "You can't just do that. Where the hell are we supposed to go?" It was that sentence that finally broke something loose in me. Not the cruelty, but the presumption that even after what they'd done, after casting me out like spoiled milk, they still believed they had a right to comfort, that my obligation to their ease remained intact. I took a slow breath, staring at the cracked wallpaper in my room. That's not my concern anymore. He hung up. 2 days later, Clarissa scheduled a walkthrough with a potential buyer, an investor named Leland who specialized in elderly-owned vintage properties, which I quickly learned was code for homes that had been neglected, emotionally, if not physically. He brought an assistant, a young woman with a clipboard and a GoPro. They arrived in a black SUV and stepped out like they were filming an episode of some home-flipping show. Clarissa met them on the lawn. I stood across the street, leaning against a bus stop pole, trying not to be seen. The house looked the same, though now there were wind chimes on the porch that hadn't been there before, and a potted plant I'd never have chosen. Leland knocked. After a minute, the door opened. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Belinda's body language. Stiff, defensive, arms crossed, mouth tight. Clarissa handed her the letter again. Belinda snatched it, skimmed it, then turned and shouted something back into the house. Edgar appeared behind her, disheveled and red-faced. Leland introduced himself and offered his hand. Neither of them took it. The viewing lasted less than 6 minutes. Belinda followed them through each room like a prison guard escorting convicts. Clarissa kept her professionalism, but I could tell from the angle of her shoulders that she was furious. Leland smiled through it all. I watched him nod, take photos, murmur things to his assistant. When they emerged, he turned to Clarissa and gave a thumbs up. The next day, Clarissa called me. "Leland's interested. He says he'll offer $1.18 million if we can get the interior cleaned out." "Cleaned out?" I asked. "He wants it vacated. Says it's a condition of the sale." "Can we do that?" "Only if they agree, or we go to court and file for forcible eviction, which could take months." I was quiet. "You okay with that?" she asked. I told her I was, that I had waited months already. I could wait more. But they couldn't. A week later, I received a letter at the motel, handwritten on a card with sunflowers. Belinda's handwriting, looping and fake-friendly. "Dear Walter," it began, as if we were strangers. "We're very sorry for the way things turned out. We never wanted to hurt you. Emotions were high. We miss having you in the house. Perhaps we could all sit down and talk before taking such a drastic step." She signed it, "With love, Belinda and Edgar." I read the note 3 times, then folded it and placed it in the trash without ceremony. The next escalation came not through the mail, but through Naomi. She called me late on a Tuesday. "You should know," she said carefully. "They've retained legal counsel." I didn't react. "Their lawyer has filed an injunction to block the sale, claiming that you're mentally unfit to make such decisions. They're arguing diminished capacity." The room went silent. My pulse ticked once, then again. "They're trying to say I'm senile?" "Yes," she said flatly. "They included a statement from a psychiatrist, unlicensed by the way, claiming you've shown signs of memory loss and confusion. They allege you wandered from the property, that you've been aggressive, that you're unable to care for yourself. It's all lies." "Of course it is," Naomi said. "But we'll need to prove it. We'll schedule an independent evaluation. 3 specialists, full cognitive assessment. I'm not worried, Walter. I've seen you think circles around judges. I smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you," I said. "Let's do it." The tests were long but not difficult. A neuropsychologist asked me to draw a clock. I drew it twice. Once with the hand set to 7:25. Once to 12:10. He raised an eyebrow and asked why I did both. "Because you didn't specify AM or PM," I said. The psychiatrist gave me a list of words and asked me to recall them in 5 minutes. I recalled all 12. The gerontologist asked how I handled my finances. I handed him a spreadsheet I'd created to track my expenses since moving out. He laughed. "You're more organized than I am." The final report was unequivocal. No signs of cognitive decline. Fully competent. No medical basis to interfere with property decisions. Naomi submitted the report. The injunction was denied. The sale was back on track. That evening, I sat outside the motel in a plastic chair, the same soup warming on the hot plate. I watched the sun dip behind the billboard for personal injury law, the sky turning the color of rust. I thought about Edgar, his face as a boy, wide-eyed and silly, asking me to read The Wind in the Willows 3 times in a row. I thought about Belinda, the first time I met her, nervous, overly polite, eyes darting around the living room as if assessing resale value. I thought about Miriam's and how she'd always warned me. "Walter, be careful. Kindness is often mistaken for weakness." She had been right, but not anymore. They had thrown me out with nothing but a bag and a cane. Now I was coming back not just to reclaim what was mine, but to erase the fantasy they'd built upon my silence. I wasn't a ghost, I wasn't senile, and I wasn't done yet. The morning of the court's final ruling on the injunction arrived without drama. No lightning, no prophetic dreams, just the same dry Los Angeles sun creeping through the blinds of my motel window, slicing the room into geometric shapes. I didn't go to the hearing. Naomi insisted there was no need. My presence might only add fuel to whatever dramatics Belinda was no doubt prepared to unleash. Instead, I sat in the cafe across the street from the courthouse, nursing a bitter coffee and letting the cheap plastic chair press its shape into my back. When the call came through, Naomi's voice was cool and steady. The judge dismissed the injunction. "Fully and without reservation, your mental fitness is now court-affirmed and documented. We're clear to proceed with the sale." I thanked her, closed my phone and sat back. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. Not yet. Vindication without reckoning is just paperwork. Later that same day, Clarissa confirmed that Leland was still ready to buy. His assistant had already drawn up documents, the money was lined up, and he was eager to move quickly, within the month. I gave her the go-ahead. She asked if I wanted to inform Edgar and Belinda directly. I said no. They would get the final notice by mail like everyone else. There would be no more private appeals, no more tear-streaked notes with sunflower borders. I was finished being the back door they thought they could always sneak through. The following afternoon, I visited the house for the first time since I'd been cast out. Clarissa arranged the viewing with Belinda and Edgar under the pretense of a final walkthrough. They didn't know I'd be there. I didn't want to frighten anyone. I only wanted to see it one last time before it was stripped of meaning. I stood on the sidewalk first, looking at the front lawn that had gone to seed. The hydrangeas Miriam once loved were wilted and dry, forgotten under the weight of ornamental rocks someone had laid down with no sense of rhythm or grace. A fake owl perched on the fence, plastic eyes watching nothing. When I rang the bell, it was Edgar who answered. He looked different, thinner maybe, or just more tired. His face, once so full of idle confidence, sagged in ways that made me ache, despite everything. He froze when he saw me, as if seeing a ghost from a life he had tried to misplace. "Dad," he said, voice small. I stepped inside without asking. This won't take long. Belinda appeared in the hallway like a well-trained cat. She wore a stiff blouse and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We weren't expecting you," she said, accusatory. "This is still our home, for now." I ignored her, walking past toward the living room. The layout was mostly unchanged, but the spirit of it had been gutted. Miriam's porcelain vases were gone. The family photos had been replaced by generic art prints, all beige and blue tones that screamed real estate staging. Even the clock, my father's clock, the one that had chimed every hour of my childhood, had been taken down. I noticed it stacked under a pile of magazines in the corner, as if it were just another thing that didn't fit the aesthetic. Clarissa arrived a few minutes later, cheerful and composed, clipboard in hand. "Afternoon, folks," she said brightly. "I'm here for a quick final walkthrough, just verifying condition for the buyers." Belinda started to protest, but Clarissa cut her off, not unkindly. "Per the court decision, we're moving forward. This is a formality. You'll have until the end of the month to vacate." She turned to me, barely concealing her grin. "Mr. Grant, would you like to walk with me?" And so I did. Room by room, we moved through the house like archaeologists in reverse, identifying not what was ancient, but what had been altered. The office, once my reading room, was now a cluttered disaster of ring lights, unopened packages, and some sort of amateur podcast setup. The kitchen, stripped of character, had been repainted in sterile gray, with motivational fridge magnets replacing Miriam's old recipe cards. In the guest room, the one they had forced me into for nearly 6 months, the bed was gone. A treadmill stood there now, dusty and unused, its cord chewed through at the base. I didn't ask. Upstairs, I paused outside my old bedroom door. Clarissa looked at me. "Do you want to go in?" I nodded. The door creaked open, and the air inside was still, untouched. They hadn't used it. My bed remained where it had been, stripped of linen, a few cobwebs in the corners. The photo of Miriam and me at our 35th anniversary was still on the dresser, slightly tilted, as if someone had moved it carelessly. I walked to it and straightened it without a word. When I turned, Edgar was standing in the doorway. "This doesn't have to happen," he said. "We can fix this." I met his eyes. "You had the chance to fix this. You chose silence. You chose Belinda's convenience over my dignity." His mouth moved, but no words came. Just behind him, I saw Belinda pacing like a woman denied a seat at a table she thought she owned. Clarissa stepped between us gently. "We're done here," she said. As we walked back outside, I didn't look back. I didn't want to give the walls the power of memory anymore. Clarissa turned to me once we reached the sidewalk. "You okay?" I nodded. "I'm fine." She paused, hesitating. "You know they'll try something else." "Let them," I said. "I'm not hiding." The next morning, my motel room felt smaller than usual, but also cleaner, as if something had been burned out of it in my absence. I sat at the tiny table by the window, Miriam's photo beside my morning coffee, and I realized that something had shifted. I no longer thought of the house as mine. Not really. Not the way I used to. It had become a battleground, a failed shrine, a hostage taken by familiarity and fear. Letting it go wasn't just practical, it was necessary. Sometimes the only way to reclaim your peace is to set fire to the altar they built on your back. And I was ready to light the match. The paperwork was nearly complete. Clarissa had set the closing date for the following month. The buyer had transferred the deposit into escrow. The house would soon be sold, legally and irrevocably. And yet, I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. There was still something lingering, like the final echo of a storm that hasn't yet passed. I could feel it in the silence that followed our final walkthrough, in the absence of phone calls, in the way the motel walls felt like they were listening. I knew Belinda wouldn't accept this quietly. She was the type to twist the knife before accepting that it was in her chest. Edgar, for all his weakness, still carried enough pride to choke on. There was more coming. I could feel it like weather. And then it came. Naomi called one morning as I was buttering a piece of toast that tasted like cardboard. Her voice was unusually stiff. "They've filed a counterclaim," she said. I didn't respond immediately. I had learned by now that silence was sometimes more useful than any immediate emotion. "On what grounds?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Undue influence," she replied. "They're alleging that Clarissa, myself and you, conspired to sell the home without giving them proper notice. They claim you've been manipulated, coerced into selling your primary residence under duress and emotional instability." I scoffed. "That's ridiculous. The court already confirmed my capacity." "Yes," Naomi said calmly. "But this isn't about truth. It's about obstruction. They're trying to stall the sale. If they can force a delay long enough, they think the buyer will walk. It's pressure, Walter. They want you to fold." "Then let them press," I said. "I'm not folding." But the pressure came in ways I hadn't anticipated. That afternoon, I discovered my bank card no longer worked. I went to the branch in person and was greeted by a tight-lipped teller who informed me that a fraud alert had been placed on the account. "At your request," she added. I shook my head. No, it wasn't. A manager was summoned. After half an hour of paperwork and ID verification, it became clear that someone had impersonated me on the phone to initiate a temporary freeze. I had to sit in a grey plastic chair for nearly 2 hours while they restored access. My joint account with Edgar, something I had forgotten even existed, once set up in the early 2000s to help with his college tuition, showed recent attempts to move money. Nothing had gone through thanks to Naomi's advice months ago to sever his access to anything financial. Still, the attempt was made. They were reaching into any pocket I might have left. At the motel, I returned to find a message slipped under the door. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper with bold, printed text. "You're too old to be doing this. Back off while you still can." There was no name, no handwriting, just the words, heavy and cheap, printed on standard white paper and folded once. I read it twice, then tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. I didn't need to call anyone to know who it was from. It had Belinda's signature all over it. Cruelty without subtlety, threat without elegance. The next day, I filed a police report. Not because I believed anything would come of it, but because I needed it documented. Naomi said it might help if the threats escalated, and we both suspected they would. Clarissa, meanwhile, began working with the buyer's legal team to shore up the transaction. "They've seen this kind of drama before," she said. "Divorces, probate wars, siblings fighting over land. Buyers who want this neighborhood don't scare easy." Still, we both knew time was now the enemy. The longer the process dragged, the more likely the buyer would drop out. And if he did, it would reset the entire clock. New listings, new showings, new risks. I couldn't let that happen. And then came the visit. It was late afternoon. I had just returned from the grocery store, a brown paper bag filled with soup cans, crackers, instant coffee. My knees were aching from the long walk. When I turned the corner toward my motel room, I saw them, Edgar and Belinda, standing outside the door, as if they belonged there, as if their presence wasn't a violation of every last boundary I'd ever tried to erect. Belinda was wearing oversized sunglasses, her mouth pressed into a line so sharp it could cut steel. Edgar looked pale, twitchy, exhausted. His hands were jammed into his jacket pockets like he was trying to disappear into himself. I stopped, said nothing, just stood 10 feet away, waiting. Belinda made the first move. "We need to talk," she said. "You've made your point, Walter, but this is going too far." I didn't move. "How did you find me?" "You're not hard to find," Edgar muttered. "You use the same bank, same lawyer." I looked at Naomi's card in my wallet later that night and realized they must have followed a paper trail she'd tried to shield. It didn't matter. They were here now, and they'd crossed the final line. "What do you want?" I asked, voice low. Belinda stepped forward, too close. "We want you to stop this. We want you to call off the sale and come to your senses. You're acting like a lunatic. You're going to destroy everything, your family, your name." "For what? A few $100,000? I almost laughed. "You think this is about money?" I asked. "After everything you did?" Edgar flinched. "Dad, please. Can we just talk inside? Just 10 minutes. That's all we're asking." I stared at him. "You had 10 years to talk. You had my house, my kindness, my patience. You had a man who never said no, even when he should have. And you used it up. There's no talk left." Belinda's mask cracked. Her lips curled. "You were a stubborn, bitter old man before we even moved in. You sat in that house like a tombstone, judging everything. No wonder your wife died early. Living with you probably felt like a sentence." The words hit like glass. Not because they were true, but because they were meant to destroy. I said nothing. There was no response that could have salvaged dignity from that cruelty. Edgar tried to speak, but Belinda grabbed his arm and dragged him back. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You're going to rot alone, and no one will even notice." She turned, marched down the walkway. Edgar hesitated, eyes on the ground, then followed. I watched them leave, their figures shrinking with distance, and I felt something fall away inside me. Not grief, not anger, just the final thread of hope that any part of them still cared about me as a person. The sale moved forward. Clarissa pushed the buyer's team to sign quickly. Naomi responded to every petty motion from their lawyer with airtight precision. They had tried everything: personal appeals, legal sabotage, threats, emotional landmines, and now they were cornered. The property was no longer theirs to weaponize. It was mine, and I was letting it go, not as a surrender, but as a final act of liberation. 2 weeks before closing, I walked past the house again. I didn't go inside. I didn't knock. I just stood across the street, staring at it in silence. The porch light was on, even though it was midday. The wind chimes rattled like bones. I realized then that the house wasn't mine anymore. Not because I had sold it, but because it had already died. The home Miriam and I had built, the laughter we once had inside those walls, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet Sundays, that was all gone. What stood there now was a husk. An empty set, waiting to be gutted and rebuilt by someone who would never know its history. That was fine. Let them erase it. Let them paint over the scars. I wasn't going to live in memories that had been turned against me. I returned to the motel and sat by the window. The late sun stained the street in gold, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph. Just the soft release that comes when you finally stop begging to be seen and decide to see yourself instead. The storm was passing. The reckoning had come. And I was still standing. The day the sale closed, I didn't speak to anyone. Not the bank clerk who called to confirm the deposit. Not Clarissa, who left a voicemail saying, "It's done." Not even Naomi, who had worked for months to get me to this point. I just sat alone in my apartment, staring at the floor as if some message was hidden in the grain of the old wood. The silence around me wasn't peace. Not yet. It was the stillness that comes after an impact, the ringing in the ears, the disorientation of having finally hit bottom or maybe broken through it. I had done what I came to do. The house, that anchor of memory and pain, was gone. The money was in my account. There would be no appeals, no further delays. My son and his wife had no legal recourse left. And yet, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an opening, like a door quietly swinging on its hinges, letting in the cold air of what comes next. That same evening, as if summoned by the finality of the transaction, Edgar called me. His number flashed on my new phone, the one I hadn't given to anyone outside my lawyer and landlord. I answered out of reflex, not curiosity. His voice was unsteady, hollowed out. "Dad," he said, and that one word carried so much damage I almost didn't recognize it. "We got the eviction notice. We have 30 days to get out. The buyer's agent already called. Said they want to start demolition by the fall." I waited. "Okay," I said simply. There was a pause on the line that stretched too long. "You really went through with it," he said. And now there was disbelief, or maybe just sorrow, forced into the shape of accusation. "You sold the house." "Our house." That last part nearly made me laugh. "It was never your house, Edgar. You lived there. That's not the same as owning it. You know we don't have anywhere else to go. Belinda's credit is shot. My contract's dried up. We don't even have furniture. Everything's still there. Everything—" He trailed off. I said nothing. What could I say? That I was sorry? I wasn't. That I felt guilt? I didn't. Not anymore. Guilt was for mistakes, and this was not a mistake. This was the only logical conclusion to the long, slow undoing of our relationship. He exhaled, long and tired. "She blames me, you know. Says I should have stopped you. Says I should have fought harder." "She's right," I said. "You should have." There was another pause. And then, "Do you hate me?" I wasn't expecting that. It sounded like something a child would ask, not a 47-year-old man who had let his father sleep on a cot in a shelter. I thought about the question, genuinely. Did I hate him? Number I didn't. That would have required more energy than I had left for him. "No, Edgar," I said. "I don't hate you, but I don't trust you. And I don't want you in my life." He choked a little on that. I could hear him swallowing words. "What about the kids?" he asked. "Hazel and Reggie? They'll never forgive you." "I haven't seen them in 5 years," I said quietly. "They made their choice. Or maybe you made it for them. That's not fair. Neither was being thrown out of my own house," I snapped, and then caught myself, voice trembling slightly. I inhaled. Let's not pretend this was mutual. Let's not rewrite it into something softer than what it was. The silence on the other end grew longer. "She's leaving," he said suddenly. "Belinda. She said she's done with me. That I ruined everything. She screamed at me for hours last night. Said if I'd been a man, you never would have gotten away with it." I said nothing. There was no comfort I could offer. No advice. That version of Edgar, the one who might have earned my guidance, was long gone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was almost inaudible. "I know," I replied. And I did know, but it didn't matter anymore. We hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down on the windowsill, stared out across the street where cars moved through the amber light like small, determined fish. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, letting the weight of everything Edgar hadn't said settle into the room. Somewhere in that phone call he had been trying to reach for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a lifeline. But I was no longer holding the other end. 3 days later, I received a formal notice from Clarissa. The funds had cleared, the keys had transferred, the buyer was proceeding with renovation. The house on Halberd Street was no longer mine in any sense, legal or emotional. I printed the email and placed it in a folder marked Final, then slid it into the drawer of my desk beside documents for Miriam's burial and the certificate of sale for my old car. I didn't plan to look at it again. That same afternoon, I went for a long walk. Not the kind I used to take when I lived in the old neighborhood, back when every corner reminded me of some fragment of life with Miriam. This was a new route, one that curved around the lake behind my apartment complex, past the dog park, through a line of eucalyptus trees that made the whole air smell like mint and wood smoke. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of it settle my breath. It was strange how the world didn't shift even after your whole life did, how trees still rustled and children still laughed in the distance, how people still threw sticks for dogs and the ducks still gathered by the shore, indifferent to my personal history. When I came back home, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox. No return address. Handwritten in careful cursive. I opened it slowly, not sure what to expect. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The note read, "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. I used to live down the street from you in the 90s. You let me mow your lawn when I was 12. Gave me $5 and a bottle of root beer every Saturday. My family moved away, but I never forgot how kind you were. My mom said you were the last good neighbor we ever had. I saw your name in the listing, just wanted to say thanks. You made a difference." The photo was of my front lawn from decades ago. I was standing on the porch, a rake in hand. Miriam sat in a chair by the garden, a sun hat on her head. It had been taken from across the street, probably by that same boy. The picture was slightly faded, the colors warm. I stared at it for a long time. And that's when it happened. Not the closure, not the healing, but the arrival of something quieter. Meaning. I realized that even as I dismantled the house, burned the last bridges, carved my name out of my family's life, something remained. The impression of kindness, of presence, of having once been a part of something. That was more than they could erase. The house was gone. Edgar was gone. Belinda would disappear soon if she hadn't already. But I was still here. I still had a name, a past, a soul. And no one was going to take that from me again. 3 months have passed since the house was sold. In that time, the seasons have shifted almost imperceptibly, as they tend to in this part of California, where autumn doesn't arrive with color but with the slight easing of heat and the return of evening breezes. I've settled into my new apartment on the second floor of a modest complex just outside San Diego, where the air carries ocean salt instead of freeway dust, and the neighbors keep mostly to themselves. There is a widow in the unit below me, Lorraine, mid-70s, kind-eyed with an old beagle named Jasper and a habit of baking cinnamon bread on weekends. We talk sometimes on the stairs or at the mailboxes, and though we never say much, there is something soothing about her presence, a shared rhythm of people who've lived long enough to understand the value of silence over performance. The apartment is small, but it is enough. I brought little with me, only what fit in the car Naomi helped me rent, and what I felt was worth carrying. A few clothes, Miriam's photo, my records, a chipped ceramic bowl Edgar made in the 8th grade, which for some reason I couldn't part with. Everything else I left behind without regret. My days have returned to simplicity. I rise early, as always, make oatmeal with a dash of salt and sugar, just like Miriam used to. I walk by the ocean most mornings, taking in the quiet majesty of the waves, the regularity of tide and foam that remind me the world does not stop for grief, nor slow for resentment. I read the paper on a bench facing west, watch old couples walk dogs in pairs, and sometimes let the sun rest on my face for whole minutes without moving. The pace suits me. There's no one to rush for, no one to avoid, just the hum of traffic from a distance and the occasional bird that comes to inspect my breadcrumbs. I began volunteering twice a week at the local library, shelving books and helping seniors with the computers. The staff were surprised when I first showed up, an older man with a cane and no nonsense. But they soon welcomed me. I taught a woman how to reset her email password last week. She cried afterward, said it was the first time she'd seen photos of her grandson in 2 years. I told her it was nothing, but she insisted on baking me banana bread. I accepted, and it was terrible. But I ate every bite. I haven't heard from Edgar since our final call. I don't expect I will. The children never reached out. Maybe they were too young to understand what had happened. Or maybe they understood perfectly and simply chose a side. Either way, the silence is clean. Not like the silence that filled my house in those last months before I left, heavy with judgment and distance. This silence is mine. I don't dwell on the what-ifs anymore. That path is long and circular and ends nowhere. I've made peace with the decision. I had to. I had spent too much of my life asking for room in my own story. When I finally took it, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like survival. Sometimes I still see the house in my dreams, not as it became, but as it was. The kitchen smells like garlic and lemon. The radio plays quietly. Miriam hums while stirring sauce, and Edgar is 8 years old again, showing me a school project with glue on his hands. It's always dusk in those dreams, the light golden, the windows glowing. No one is angry. No one is silent. I wake from those dreams without pain, just a soft ache that fades by the time I've had my coffee. Memory doesn't always have to be sharp to be true. I think the most surprising thing about all of this, in the end, is how light I feel. I spent so many years believing that duty meant staying, that loyalty meant enduring, that love meant silence. But it turns out, sometimes love means leaving. Sometimes it means drawing a line, not out of spite, but to protect what remains of your dignity. I gave them everything I had. My home, my patience, my name. When they asked for more, I gave them the door instead. And now, in this quiet apartment above a kind widow and her ancient dog, with the sea a short walk away and the sky wide open, I've begun to imagine the unlikeliest future of all. One where I'm not anyone's burden, not anyone's relic, not anyone's shame. Just a man with time left, space reclaimed, and a name that finally belongs only to him. My name is Walter Grant. I was forgotten, dismissed, and erased. But I endured, and I am still here.